Welcome to VSO W, the deep dive, where we take a stack of critical research and extract the most vital knowledge and surprising insights just for you.
That's right.
Today, we're really digging into something complex, something that sits right at this charged intersection of social policy, political movements, and, public health. We're talking about respectability politics.
Exactly. And, we often talk about behavioral standards in, well, marginalized community, usually in sort of moral terms,
Okay.
right? Like, is it helpful? Is that authentic?
Sure.
But the sources we're looking at today, they really force us to look way beyond that. Our mission here is to get a handle on the profound, measurable physical and mental health costs. It's this concept the research calls vigilance, basically. The cost of just trying to exist, to survive in these racialized social spaces day in, day out.
So this deep dive, it's really your shortcut to understanding the real, often hidden price that people pay when they're striving to meet those dominant cultural expectations. We're going to unpack research that defines this vigilance thing as a unique chronic stressor. We'll look at the biological toll, how it actually impacts the body.
Yeah, quantify it.
And we'll evaluate, using actual data, how effective this whole strategy has even been politically for different marginalized groups. It's kind of like we're charting the cost-benefit analysis of trying to be, twice as good.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with a clear definition. When the sources talk about respectability politics, or RP, what exactly are they referring to?
So fundamentally, it's about regulating your own behavior, how you present yourself in public.
Right.
And it's really driven by this strong desire to, push back against negative racial stereotypes.
Okay, it's about managing perception.
Exactly. But that second part is really key. It's not just about, say, self-improvement for its own sake. RP is about presenting yourself as a citizen who is worthy of respect.
Worthy?
Yeah, and that worthiness, crucially, is defined by the dominant culture's norms and standards. The majority society gets to set the bar. So it's an external performance, really, aimed at trying to get some internal defense or safety.
You got it.
What's really striking is how the sources immediately anchor this historically. This isn't some new idea, right? It's an adaptive strategy people have used for a long, long time.
Oh, absolutely. Over a century. The term itself, respectability politics, well, it was coined by the historian Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. That was back in 1993.
Okay.
And she was applying it very specifically to the women's movement within the Black Baptist Church, looking at the period roughly between 1880 and 1920.
Wow. Okay. So turn of the 20th century. And what kind of agenda were they promoting back then? It sounds like it was pretty prescriptive.
Oh, incredibly comprehensive, very prescriptive. Think traditional Victorian values, basically.
Like what?
Well, temperance, so staying away from alcohol.
Yeah.
Cleanliness, personal, home, everything. Thrift, being careful with money. Polite manners, of course. And maybe most emphasized, strict sexual purity.
So these were held up as the standard you had to meet to be seen as respectable, to get social acceptance.
That was the idea, yeah.
Yeah.
That these were framed as the necessary preconditions.
So it feels like this strategy had a clear dual audience right from the start.
Precisely. You nailed it. The first goal was internal, right? Moral uplift, trying to create social stability within the Black community. But the second goal, that was external. It was political. It was about proving to white America, look, we meet your standards of respectability.
In the hope that proving that would somehow lessen discrimination or prejudice or even violence.
That was the hope. Exactly. To show they were worthy citizens.
Which really highlights the sort of tragedy baked into the strategy, doesn't it? The idea that a whole group has to perform just to get basic dignity. But the sources mention this created internal issues, too.
It absolutely did. Because by demanding everyone stick to these very specific, often middle-class white norms, RP ended up reinforcing class and status differences within the African-American community itself.
Oh.
And the dividing lines weren't really about money. They were about behavior. How well did you perform respectability? It set up what the sources call a behavioral entrance fee for respect and citizenship.
A behavioral entrance fee.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it acted like this gatekeeper, judging people inside the community based on how closely they mirrored those external white middle-class norms. It created this internal hierarchy.
So an internal stratification driven by an external demand, that makes sense. And the sources, they connect this historical context right up to today using this idea of black armor. Let's talk about that because it really brings it to life.
Yes, that Mashable report they mentioned about millennial black men. It's a perfect modern illustration. You have these men who are actively, consciously suppressing parts of themselves, their style, their natural way of being.
Right.
Choosing really formal clothes, maybe restrictive clothes, not because they like them, but as a shield, a defense mechanism.
I remember reading about one guy, he talked about wearing a suit specifically because it felt like armor. He said something like, and I think this quote is worth repeating, "When I have a suit on, I feel like all of a sudden the world sees me differently. Cops aren't staring, people wave back, people shake my hand, they open the door for me."
Yeah. That's incredibly telling, isn't it? The suit isn't about fashion. It's a tool.
Yeah.
It's functioning as this visible shield against expected negative interactions, trying to preempt stereotypes before they even land.
It's like the modern version of respectability politics in action, managing yourself proactively just to navigate the world safely, to get basic courtesy. But, the sources make it clear that the suit or the careful manners or the precise language, that's just the visible part, the performance. It points to something deeper, this invisible psychological armoring that's happening constantly.
We're reminded of that classic study, Fagan and Sykes.
Yes, exactly. That account of the older woman who talked about having to put on her shield every single morning before she even left the house.
Just imagine that. Right. A daily internal ritual, not for a specific meeting, but just to face the world outside her door, preparing for potential insults, for discrimination. And she'd been doing that, the study says, for over 60 years.
60 years.
That persistent psychological toll, that daily preparation, that's what bridges us directly to this next key concept, vigilance.
It's the constant expectation of harm that forces you to build that shield.
Okay, so if respectability politics is the outward strategy, the performance, then vigilance is the deep-seated psychological state that actually drives those behaviors.
Right.
And the research defines it quite precisely. It's this whole complex of anticipatory and ruminative thoughts and behaviors. Basically, you're constantly involved in preparing for discriminatory treatment.
Okay, let's break down anticipatory and ruminative a bit for our listeners. Anticipatory means you're always looking ahead, bracing for impact.
Yeah, expecting it. And ruminative means you're replaying stuff in your head, past insults, maybe imagining future scenarios, going over and over it. And what the sources really stress is that this state, this chronic readiness, it doesn't necessarily depend on you having just had a bad experience yesterday.
Oh, okay.
It comes from the general, pervasive sense of being devalued because you're part of a stigmatized group in a society that's, well, racially hierarchical.
Yeah.
You don't need a fresh insult to be vigilant. Just living in that system where you know these things happen is enough.
So vigilance becomes this constant, maybe low-level, but persistent stressor. It's the background noise of having to function where racism exists structurally, culturally, interpersonally.
Precisely. And the social science literature, it actually breaks down the behaviors that stem from this state into three main themes. We see these pop up again and again in interviews and surveys.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is adapting presentation of self. This is that constant effort to be careful about appearance and language.
And the goal isn't just politeness, it's instrumental.
Absolutely. It's about getting good service, avoiding harassment, just being treated with equal respect, basic stuff that others might take for granted.
And the examples in the sources show this isn't just, say, working class folks worried about interactions. It cuts across class, even into professional settings. Tell us about those Black professors.
Yeah, those interviews are really revealing. They talk about deliberately needing to over-prepare for lectures, making sure to cite their credentials up front, dressing more formally, more professionally than their white colleagues might feel the need to.
Why? What are they trying to achieve?
It's a conscious effort to manage how students perceive them, specifically to try and head off any questioning of their competence or their authority in the classroom before it even starts.
Wow.
They're essentially putting on the professional version of that black armor we talked about earlier.
That is just a tremendous amount of extra energy, isn't it? Intellectual energy, emotional energy, just to establish baseline credibility that others often get automatically. And it goes beyond just clothes, right? It affects how people speak.
Oh, profoundly. There's that really poignant personal story from a Black researcher reflecting on high school.
Yeah.
He talks about feeling this immense pressure because he felt white people were constantly judging his intelligence, his basic humanity even. So he felt he had to speak, quote, with the greatest form of articulation.
Always performing perfect speech.
Yeah, this relentless self-monitoring of every word, every tone, trying to hit this standard of perfect articulation. It's a constant tax on your brain. It's this internalized pressure that suggests Any slip-up, any vernacular might just confirm a negative stereotype in someone's mind.
Okay, so that's adapting self-presentation. What's the second theme of vigilance behaviors?
The second is avoidance behaviors. So if presentation is about controlling yourself, avoidance is about trying to control your environment.
Makes sense. How does that play out?
It's basically the conscious strategy of deciding, okay, I'm going to steer clear of certain situations or places where I think the risk of discrimination is just too high.
So it's self-preservation.
It is, absolutely. But it comes at a cost, right? You end up limiting your own life, your opportunities, your freedom of movement.
I remember that example from the qualitative study, the Black woman who became, quote, very paranoid about certain stores after being falsely accused of shoplifting.
Yeah, exactly. And her reaction is totally understandable given how traumatic that must have been. She talked about how difficult it was to ever feel comfortable shopping again.
So when everyday activities like shopping carry the threat of public humiliation or even criminal accusation, avoidance becomes, well, almost necessary, even though it shrinks your world.
Right. Every place you avoid kind of reinforces this feeling that the public sphere is potentially dangerous, that it requires constant calculation.
Okay, and the third theme?
The third theme is persistent preparation. This is really the internal part, the rumination we talked about.
The mental load?
It's the daily psychic burden, yeah. That constant state of readiness. And again, we come back to that powerful quote from Fagan and Sykes. I somewhat stay prepared to be discriminated against because I never know when it's going to happen to me.
That never know when. That's the exhausting part.
That anticipation is just this daily, unrelenting psychological toll.
So how common is this? How pervasive is this vigilance coping style? The researchers used data from Chicago, right? The CCAHS study. What did they find about frequency among Black adults there?
Yeah, the Chicago Community Adult Health Study data really confirms this is widespread. Now, there's a minority, about 18%, who said they never engage in these vigilant behaviors.
Okay.
But that means the vast majority, over 80%, engage in vigilance, at least some of the time. And here's a really striking part. 31%, nearly one-third, reported engaging in some aspect of vigilance frequently.
And frequently means?
At least once a week, or even almost daily.
Wow. So almost a third of this population is actively carrying that psychological weight, that anticipation and preparation on a weekly, maybe even daily basis.
Did the data show if people tended towards one type of vigilance more than others, like appearance versus language?
Yes, and this is subtle but really interesting. The strategy seemed to favor monitoring oral communication over managing appearance.
Really? How so? A huge number, 44%, reported carefully watching what they say and how they say it at least once a week.
Oh.
Now, compare that instant. Only 15% reported being careful about their appearance that often.
That's a big difference. 44% watching their words versus 15% watching their appearance.
Yeah. It suggests that maybe the most persistent day-to-day form of vigilance is that internal verbal self-management. Meticulously monitoring your speech to try and manage how others perceive your intelligence or maybe how threatening you seem. It's like this almost continuous self-editing process.
So while the black armor, the suits, definitely exist, maybe the heavier burden, the more constant one, is actually managing language.
That's what the data seems to suggest, yes.
Yeah.
But now we really have to shift gears and talk about the critical findings, the direct biological fallout from maintaining this state of chronic anticipation.
Right. This is where it stops being just about social dynamics or politics and becomes literally biological. The health costs of chronic vigilance. The sources use that phrase, death by 1,000 cuts. And they bring in Ta-Nehisi Coates talking about Jackie Robinson, maybe the ultimate figure of respectability who had to be twice as good.
Yeah, and Coates makes that crucial point, reminding everyone, you got to remember Jackie Robinson died young. Don't ever forget that. Every time you say that, remember that. And the sources are basically saying, look, the science is now showing us the mechanism for why that kind of chronic self-regulation, that constant performance, took such a massive toll on his health and takes a toll on others.
Okay, let's walk through that mechanism. It's all about stress, fundamentally. When you anticipate something stressful, your body flips the switch on its main stress response system, the HPA axis, right? Hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
That's the one, your fight or flight system.
And a short burst of that is fine, even healthy, if there's a real temporary threat, or maybe you're gearing up for a public speech.
Exactly. The system is designed for acute stress. But vigilance means that anticipation, that rumination, constantly thinking, I have to be ready for discrimination, it becomes chronic.
So it's never turned off.
Pretty much. This sustained state of readiness pushes the body's HPA axis into overdrive constantly. And over time, that leads to dysfunction.
So if the HPA axis is like a car engine, vigilance is like keeping that engine revving in the red zone all the time.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Instead of revving high for a short sprint and then returning to idle, the engine is just constantly stressed. And that prolonged biological stress response, it wears down the regulatory systems, it degrades them over time, leading directly to poorer physical and mental health.
And what's fueling this chronic stress isn't just your own personal bad experiences, right? The sources say it's broader than that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fueled by discrimination you experience yourself, for sure, but also by vicarious experiences seeing or hearing about things happening to others, like, say, the death of Sandra Bland.
Right.
And it's also fueled just by the knowledge of structural racism, knowing about mass incarceration rates, seeing biased media portrayals. All of that contributes to this feeling that you constantly need to be on guard.
Which must make this kind of stress uniquely potent compared to, say, worrying about an exam.
It seems so. The research cited suggests that anticipating potential prejudice or discrimination actually triggers a significantly stronger biological stress response than anticipating other common stressors, like that difficult test or public speaking.
So the expectation of racial bias is particularly toxic to the system.
That's what the evidence points to, yes.
Okay, let's get back to the CCAHS data, the Chicago study. They looked at specific health outcomes, adjusting for things like age, income, education, to try and isolate the impact of vigilance. What was the first major finding related to chronic conditions?
This one is pretty staggering, frankly. The data showed that frequent vigilance is associated with a 25% greater lifetime count of chronic conditions.
25% greater.
Yeah, the incidence unit ratio, the IRR, was 1.25.
Okay, 25% isn't small change. That sounds substantial. Can you help us visualize what that 1.25 ratio really means in practice?
Sure. Let's imagine someone who reports never being vigilant. Over their lifetime, maybe they develop 4 chronic conditions, let's say. Hypertension, diabetes, asthma, maybe some chronic pain.
Okay.
What this finding suggests is that a person who is frequently vigilant, but otherwise similar in terms of age, demographics, etc., would statistically report 5 chronic conditions over that same lifetime. 1 additional major illness.
Wow, so it's like the stress is accelerating aging or triggering more diseases or making them happen earlier?
That's certainly the implication. It suggests the burden of respectability and vigilance is literally getting imprinted on the body in the form of disease.
Okay, that's the physical side. What about mental health? What did the research find regarding depressive symptoms?
Similar pattern. Vigilance showed a strong graded relationship with depressive symptoms, meaning the more vigilant you are, the higher your symptom score.
How much higher?
Those who engaged in vigilant behaviors frequently reported a level of depressive symptoms that was almost half a point higher on the scale compared to the non-vigilant group.
Now, half a point on a scale might sound kind of abstract. Did the researchers give any context for how big that difference actually is?
They did, and it's powerful context. They compared the size of that increase, the difference linked to frequent vigilance, to the known gap in depressive symptoms based on education level.
Okay.
And they found that the increase in depressive symptoms from frequent vigilance is statistically comparable to the difference in symptoms between someone with a post-baccalaureate degree, so very high education, and someone who hasn't even completed the 9th grade.
Whoa, wait. So you're saying the mental health toll of just preparing for prejudice daily is as significant as the mental health gap associated with nearly a decade of missed education?
That's the comparison they draw, yes. It's an incredibly stark way to show the magnitude. It directly links the emotional burden of vigilance to major, well-recognized social disparities in health.
It really hammers home that this coping mechanism, which is meant to be protective, is actually acting as a major mental health liability.
Absolutely. And then finally, they look at self-rated health, or SRH, which is a really important measure. It basically asks people, how would you rate your overall health? And it's often a strong predictor of future illness and even mortality.
And did SRH follow the same worrying trend?
It did. More frequent vigilance predicted worse self-rated health. Look at the contrast. Only 12% of the frequently vigilant group rated their health as excellent, compared to 21%, nearly double among those who never engaged in vigilance.
And on the other end, fair or poor health.
Yeah. Conversely, 22% of the frequently vigilant group rated their health as only fair or poor, which is a really concerning sign. That's compared to just 13% of the never vigilant group.
So the big takeaway here seems crystal clear. Vigilance isn't just some neutral way of coping. It's acting as this unique, toxic, racialized stressor. And it's very likely contributing significantly to those persistent, stubborn racial and ethnic health gaps we keep seeing.
Exactly. The cost is literally measured in years of health and life. Okay, so now that we've established this immense internal cost, the biological toll of vigilance, we have to pivot to the external question. How well does respectability politics actually work? Does it achieve its goal of reducing prejudice, driving real change?
And the sources raise a pretty significant critique here, linking modern RP to neoliberalism. How does that connection work?
Well, think about what neoliberalism emphasizes. Individual responsibility, right? Self-reliance, market solutions. It tends to downplay structural issues and cut back on social safety nets.
Okay.
Respectability politics kind of dovetails neatly with that. It shifts the focus away from demanding big structural transformations like, say, better job programs, equitable school funding, housing reform.
And puts the focus where instead?
Onto individual self-correction. The message becomes, lift yourself up by your bootstraps, by behaving according to these prescribed middle-class norms. Fix yourself, not the system.
So it sort of prepares people behaviorally for the market economy, while conveniently ignoring the huge structural barriers like sky-high Black youth unemployment or decades of disinvestment that the market itself creates or worsens.
Exactly. It can function as a major distraction. And the sources give a really potent example of this. That 2011 speech by Michael Nutter, who was the mayor of Philadelphia at the time.
Right. Tell us about that. It seems like a perfect case study of RP overshadowing policy.
So there had been this incident, a violent flash mob involving Black youth in the city center. Mayor Nutter, who is Black himself, goes to address the public significantly in a Black church.
Okay.
And his speech is long, almost half an hour. And it's almost entirely focused on condemning the behavior of the youth, just railing against them.
Like what kind of things did he say?
He told them to stop acting like idiots and fools. He demanded, take those doggone hoodies down, pull your pants up.
Yeah.
It was very moralizing. And the sources note the congregation was sort of chanting along, buy a belt, buy a belt.
Wow, buy a belt. That's quite something. But what were the actual serious structural issues facing those kids in their communities that this intense focus on hoodies and pants managed to distract from?
Well, the list is pretty long. At the time, Black youth unemployment in Philly was hovering somewhere between 30 and 40%, astronomical.
30 to 40%.
Yeah. The city had made severe budget cuts to public services, like parks and rec programs, which hit these communities hardest. The public school system was in deep crisis due to chronic underfunding.
So huge systemic failures.
Massive failures. But by focusing public anger and debate on sagging pants and hoodies on individual moral failings, RP provided a convenient way to avoid talking about the mayor's policy failures, or state and federal failures.
It shifted the blame downwards. And this tension, this choosing of who represents the worthy victim versus the unworthy one, it has deep roots, right? It goes back to the classic civil rights movement.
Oh, absolutely. The way the movement strategically prioritized certain victims who fit that respectable mold is well documented.
Yeah.
The classic example everyone knows is Rosa Parks.
Right.
She was presented as this immaculate, quiet, dignified 42-year-old NAACP member and secretary. She was seen as the perfect, respectable symbol for the Montgomery bus boycott.
And she was chosen over someone else, wasn't she?
Yes, she was prioritized over Claudette Colvin. Colvin had actually defied the same segregation law on a bus months earlier in 1955.
So why wasn't Colvin the face of the movement?
Because she was deemed unrespectable. She was only 15, she was unmarried, and she later became pregnant. The movement leadership worried she wouldn't appeal to the sympathetic white audiences they felt they needed for funding and legitimacy. So Colvin was sidelined.
It's that behavioral entrance fee again, determining who gets to be the symbol. But the sources argue there's been a significant shift with more contemporary movements, specifically Black Lives Matter.
Yes, a really radical shift, actually. BLM seemed to explicitly reject that need for a respectable victim.
How so?
Think about who sparked some of the biggest protests. Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray. These were individuals who were often poor, maybe didn't present as polished, some had histories of petty crime.
Right.
But the movement embraced their cases. Their death ignited mass protests and forced a national reckoning. It demonstrated that your class background, or whether you had a criminal record, was no longer a barrier to recognizing your fundamental humanity and the injustice of your death. The value was inherent in the life itself, not tied to a performance of respectability.
It was a rejection of that entrance fee, which is powerful. Yet, The sources also point out that the ideology of respectability is still deeply ingrained, even among Black elites who've arguably benefited from past RP strategies.
Yeah, we see that persistence, maybe tragically, when even President Obama, seen by many as the absolute pinnacle of respectability, used the term thugs to describe the Baltimore protesters after Freddie Gray's death.
Right, I remember that.
That moment really revealed how that conservative internal pressure to police behavior to adhere to RP persists right across the political spectrum, even at the very highest levels of power.
Okay, so to really get a grip on whether RP actually works politically, the sources do something really interesting. They apply the same framework to a different group, the LGBTQ plus rights movement. Did this movement also consciously use respectability as a strategy?
Oh, absolutely. Very consciously. The goal was similar: appeal to straight Americans, gain mainstream acceptance and rights by showing that the LGBTQ community adhered to mainstream norms.
So the message was basically, we're normal, just like you.
Pretty much. Be normal. And for the LGBTQ movement, the main focus of this strategy was on relationship norms.
How so?
Well, there were these pervasive negative stereotypes about the community being promiscuous, unstable, maybe polyamorous. So the strategy was to counter that by heavily emphasizing heteronormative relationship values, exclusivity and monogamy.
So framing same-sex relationships not as something radical or different, but as fundamentally conservative, like embodying traditional values of commitment and stability.
Exactly. Strategy documents explicitly told advocates and plaintiffs to use words like long-term, lifelong, stable, permanent when talking about their relationships. The whole idea was to demonstrate, look, we share your values, therefore we deserve the same rights.
And just like in the civil rights movement, they were very careful about choosing who represented the cause, seeking out those perfect plaintiffs.
Meticulously. The sources highlight the case of Edie Windsor, whose challenge to the Defense of Marriage Act went all the way to the Supreme Court and won.
Why was she seen as ideal?
Because she fit the mold perfectly. She was an older woman. She was widowed after a very long-term loving relationship with her female partner, seen as utterly respectable.
And the lawyers were really protective of that image.
Extremely. They actually made her promise she wouldn't talk publicly about any past sexual relationships or, quote, escapades. They were terrified that any hint of non-monogamy or, well, anything potentially scandalous might alienate straight Americans and sink the case.
Wow. They were actively curating her public persona to fit the RP script.
They went even further in another major case, Lawrence v. Texas, which was about striking down laws that criminalized consensual gay sex.
What happened there?
Well, the actual incident that led to the arrest was apparently, according to the sources, more like a booze-soaked quarrel involving casual sex. But the lawyers deliberately repackaged it. He framed it in the media and in court as being about a committed, monogamous relationship. They went to great lengths to control the narrative, even preventing the men involved from speaking to the press about what really happened, because it didn't fit the respectable, monogamous picture they wanted to paint.
That's extraordinary. The belief was that only perfect respectability could win rights.
That was the strategic calculation, yes.
So the big questions then are, what was the internal cost of forcing everyone into this one narrow mold? And did this massive effort actually work politically? Let's tackle the internal cost first. The sources call it secondary marginalization.
Yeah, the internal costs were significant. By constantly holding up only the respectable members, the monogamous, the exclusive, the ones who looked most like straight couples, the movement effectively pushed aside, even stigmatized, people whose relationships or identities didn't fit that mold.
Like people in non-monogamous relationships, or maybe people whose gender presentation wasn't conventional.
Exactly. Their needs, their perspectives, their interests got pushed to the margins. It created this internal hierarchy, this stratification, where only the good gays, the ones who perform respectability best, got the spotlight. It reinforced stigma within the community.
It sounds like that same kind of painful, self-imposed gatekeeping we saw historically in the Black community example. But okay, did it work? Did all that effort, all that internal cost actually deliver the political goods? Did it change straight minds?
This is where the empirical research really throws a wrench into the whole RP strategy. The sources detailed 2 specific survey experiments done between 2018 and 2020 that rigorously tested whether this monogamy-first strategy actually influenced straight people's attitudes.
Okay, walk us through study 1. What was the setup?
Study 1 used a classic discrimination scenario. A gay man is denied service at a business. Straight people reading the story were randomly assigned to get one of two versions.
What was the difference?
In one version, the man was described as being in a committed two-person relationship, very respectable. In the other version, he was described as being in an open three-person relationship, less respectable by mainstream standards.
And what happened? Did describing him as being in the respectable relationship make straight people more supportive?
Nope. It had basically zero effect. A null effect, as the researchers call it. Zero statistically significant difference. Changing the man's relationship status from respectable two-person to less respectable three-person didn't change how similar straight respondents felt to him, didn't change their support for his specific legal case, and didn't change their broader support for general LGBT rights. Nothing.
So potentially decades of strategic messaging focused on proving monogamy. And this experiment found it didn't move the needle at all. Did it matter if the straight person reading it was liberal or conservative?
Didn't matter. The null effect held across the political spectrum. Whether the straight respondent was very conservative or more liberal, seeing the gay man adhere to the norm of monogamy just didn't make a demonstrable difference in their empathy or their support for his rights.
That's a pretty powerful finding against the strategy. What about study 2? Did that look at a different scenario?
Yeah, study 2 used a story about a gay teacher being fired after coming out to students. Again, they manipulated how the teacher's relationship was described, committed versus open, two-person versus three-person, and looked for changes in attitudes.
Did the respectability framework any better here? Any impact?
Well, they found some minimal and inconsistent positive effects on how people felt about the teacher personally when he was in the two-person relationship. But these effects were really small, statistically weak, and not considered substantively meaningful for actually moving the needle on political support.
Okay, small effect on personal feelings maybe. But did it translate into more support for actual policy change, like protecting gay teachers from being fired?
No. Critically, the relationship description had no effect whatsoever on general support for LGBT job protections.
None at all.
None. And they even checked if maybe RP worked better for people facing multiple forms of bias, like did a black gay man need to seem extra respectable?
Yeah.
But no, the null results held true whether the teacher was portrayed as male or female, black, Latinx, or white.
So the conclusion from these experiments seems devastating for their RP strategy in this context. The supposed benefits of emphasizing respectable relationships, the core strategy for years, were minimal to non-existent for changing street public attitudes, at least in the period they studied.
That's right. All that immense internal effort, the secondary marginalization, the careful crafting of narratives, it seems to have yielded almost no measurable external political gain in terms of shifting broader public opinion or policy support. #, conclusion synthesis.
Okay, so let's try and pull all these threads together. We've looked at respectability politics and vigilance in the Black community. We've looked at it in the LGBTQ movement, and we've looked at the hard biological data on health. What's the big picture that emerges?
Well, the central insight, I think, is this really stark, maybe even shocking contrast. On the one hand, you have the extremely high internal cost of respectability politics, and on the other, you have the low, often negligible, or even non-existent external political benefit.
Right. It's crucial to emphasize, as the sources do, that RP is understandable, right? It likely emerged as a natural, anticipatory coping response in environments that are fundamentally racist or prejudiced.
Absolutely. It makes sense as a strategy, especially historically. But the research we've discussed today is pretty unequivocal about the current reality. Adhering to it, living in that resulting chronic state of vigilance, it takes a severe toll.
A severe physical and mental health toll. We're talking that 25% increased risk of chronic conditions, significantly higher rates of depressive symptoms, poorer overall health.
Exactly. The biological burden is immense.
And yet, the political effectiveness, especially now, it seems profoundly questionable. In the Black struggle, we saw how it can act as this neoliberal distraction, right? Shifting focus from huge structural problems onto individual behavior. And in the LGBTQ movement, the experimental data showed that all that intense effort to regulate messaging, to prove respectability through monogamy, it had minimal, if any, real effect on shifting majority opinion or support for rights.
Which brings us back to that crucial call to action that comes out of the research, the need to fundamentally reorient the conversation.
How so?
Instead of constantly focusing on debating, moralizing the individual behaviors of Black Americans, their clothes, their language, their relationships, the question has to be shifted outwards. It has to stay focused on the structure.
So asking the right question.
Asking the question, What is it about our American social structure, our culture, that demands that Black Americans or other marginalized groups feel the need to engage in these costly, vigilant coping behaviors in the first place?
The focus has to stay firmly on the systemic issues, the racism, the prejudice that burden people with this need for constant vigilance. It needs to be a conversation about societal failure, not individual correction.
Precisely. And maybe we can leave our listeners with this provocative thought to chew on, something to explore for themselves. Given that 25% increased risk of chronic illness linked to frequent vigilance, and given the minimal, often unproven political effectiveness of performing respectability, maybe we should start viewing these strategies of personal presentation less as a viable political tool for group advancement and more as what they demonstrably are: a profound individual health hazard imposed on people by a deeply flawed society.
That's definitely something to mull over. Is the armor actually poisoning the person inside? Well, thank you for joining us for this really deep dive into the hidden costs of respectability politics and vigilance. We hope this exploration has given you a much clearer picture of the very real health and political stakes involved.
And as always, your support is what allows us to keep bringing you these detailed, source-grounded analyses and discussions. We really appreciate you tuning in.
Yes, thank you. If you found this discussion valuable, please do take a moment to subscribe to the deep dive, maybe like this episode, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this link between psychological vigilance and those systemic health disparities.
Yeah, let us know what you think.
Thank you for listening to VSOW.